So the second idea of the origin of species that I want us to hold on to is that there is no natural essence of the species. That species occur through breeding, or through the reproductive process. That is key. And Darwin actually learns a lot from breeders. Many scientists thought breeders were kind of too low rent, low class to pay attention to. But Darwin pays a lot of attention to breeders because he understands how variations are transmitted and controlled through the breeding process. And he understands that in nature, something like that process takes place too, that there's no natural essence of the species. The variety is produced through reproduction, and that reproduction, because when it leads to greater variety, more mutations, if you will, that creates what Darwin called incipient species. That is, species are born in nature through the reproductive process. And many people found this actually disgusting, and Darwin thought that, well, that's too bad, it's science, that's how change happens, through freaks of nature reproduce, and if they reproduce and are successful, that is, they survive, then they are viewed as less freakish, they become what we'd call today the new normal. Adaptive advantages survive. Weaknesses become extinct. The human race, and here's a key idea for Darwin, the human race is not the goal of evolution. The human race is not the goal of evolution, it is one of the products of evolution. One of the products of evolution. And that, of course, for many people, especially religious people, that was a very controversial thing to claim. And Darwin makes that claim while at the same time saying, I do not think this makes human beings any less grand. It just integrates us into this organic community of nature, if I can use those romantic words. The tree of evolution, Darwin says, and we'll show you a tree here, the tree of evolution is without a trunk. It doesn't go like this and then rising here. There are lots of branches without one trunk. And for Darwin, that's key, and it really breaks the idea of a great chain of being, that somehow all the species lead up to man at the top, who is closest to God. Darwin has no use for that idea anymore. So for Darwin, massive change is a product of minute variations. So you don't need a big revolution to create big change. Lots of small variations that reproduce over time create the massive changes. And here I just want to quote to you from The Origins of Species. How fleeting are the wishes and efforts of man. How short his time. And consequently, how poor will his products be compared with those accumulated by nature during whole geologic periods. Can we wonder then that nature's production should be far truer in character than man's productions? That they should be infinitely better adapted to the most complex conditions of life and should plainly bear the stamp of far higher workmanship? So, in other words, what Darwin is saying here is that nature produces great workmanship, not human beings in the image of God. Nature produces great workmanship because it has thousands of years to do so. Millions, really, of years to do so. So Darwin uses four main types of evidence. Biogeography, that is, that certain forms of life come to exist only in certain places. Similar species exist nearby because they descend from common ancestors. So biogeography. Second is paleontology, that there are clustering patterns within geologic periods, and paleontology reveals those clustering patterns. Embryology, that the embryo is the animal in its less modified state. You can learn a lot from about the genealogy of an animal from its embryonic development. And fourth, morphology. Morphology studies the form and structure of something without consideration of the function. Natural selection works on patterns, And Darwin is so interested in studying the patterns of existing animals to trace back their geology. So 4 types of evidence: biogeography, paleontology, embryology, and morphology. Species, again, not based on essence. That is the key for Darwin. In short, we will have to treat species in the same manner as those naturalists treat genera, who admit that genera are merely artificial combinations made for convenience. Artificial combinations made for convenience. That's all a species is. This may not be a cheering prospect, but we shall at least be freed from the vain search for the undiscovered and undiscoverable essence of the term species. You can't find it out. This is where the utilitarianism came out. I'm not going to look for something that I can't really study. Again, so Darwin is using all of these strands of from English intellectual history. So in the philosopher Lennox in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy has a nice summary of natural selection that I just want to share with you here. Darwinian selection theory is a 2-step process, he writes. The production of variation unrelated to the adaptive requirements of the organism, production of variation just by chance. And the second step, the differential perpetuation of these variations that serve adaptive needs. So one, the variation produced contingently, and the second step is that some of those variations will be perpetuated because they serve the needs of the animal. If people would show me those beetles, right, and I would just be afraid of them all, right, and I would be like, I would see them, they look the same, right? And for what's I think important for us is that things that most of us would say look the same, for Darwin contain enormous variation. And paying attention to variation at the field level, the minute level, is key. The other is that the present shows us about the past. That's why genealogy is I say not rather than history, is that you find traces of the past in the present. And the present tells you whether it's the fossil record or the beetles you find in a particular area or barnacles. They tell you the story of how they come to be. Here's the conclusion of The Origin of Species. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the higher production of the higher animals, directly follows. There is grandeur in this view of life with its several powers, having been originally breathed by the Creator into new forms or into one. And while the planet has gone circling on according to the fixed laws of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being created. Darwin's trying to reassure his readers that, yes, he understands that these complex and beautiful forms are complex and beautiful, but their genealogy shows that they've come about for contingent reasons that have had adaptive function. In The Descent of Man, Darwin writes, publishes in 1871, Darwin emphasizes a few of the key points from The Origins of Species, and I want to just remind you of 4 of them. First, humans evolved differently from other primates, but humans have a common ape ancestor. 2, intelligence is not the driving force of evolution, but its byproduct. This is really key. There's no intelligence guiding evolution, but intelligence is an adaptive byproduct of evolution. Intelligence was one of those variations that get perpetuated because it helped in the struggle for survival. Morality is an adaptive change produced through the advantages of living together. In other words, morality is, again, not the guide for evolution, but people act morally because once they started living together in groups, morality proved more adaptive. That is, it helped the groups survive and helped individuals within it survive. When people behave more morally, that was an adaptive advantage rather than be a reflection of some universal law. Again, remember Bentham, get rid of those notions of the laws of the universe. Think about how you can explain things more economically. And Darwin's economical explanation of morality is that it arose because it helped perpetuate members of a community. And the last item in The Descent of Man that I want to call your attention to was in the reading we asked you to do this week is sexual selection. Sexual selection depends not on the struggle for existence, but on the struggle between males for possession of the females. The result is not death to the unsuccessful competitor, but few or no offspring. So sexual selection means that the female animal chooses the male that is most appealing to the female. And of course, the peacock is the example that Darwin and many others will use, that it seems to have no adaptive function in terms of getting food or this big, beautiful tail, but it shows the female something that the female thinks will be an advantage or finds appealing, and the female chooses her mate, and that the males evolve to be chosen by females. Sexual selection, which violated lots of conventions at Darwin's time, right? Because females are doing the choosing, and that sexual selection is based on attractiveness rather than just obvious function. So one quotation here on sexual selection from Darwin: "I fully admit that it is astonishing that the females of many birds and some mammals should be endowed with sufficient taste to appreciate ornaments, which we have reason to attribute to sexual selection. It's even more astonishing in the case of reptiles, fish, and insects." So Darwin is trying here to understand how our aesthetic preferences actually have an evolutionary dimension. Dennis Dutton, a contemporary philosopher who died recently, wrote a book on the art instinct that tried to use this understanding of sexual selection as a way of grounding aesthetics. And many others have had their imaginations piqued by Darwin's emphasis on sexual selection. We'll end our discussion of Darwin just by reminding you that he also had a way of thinking about ideas in an evolutionary context. Darwin wrote, "False facts are highly injurious to the progress of science, for they often endure long." False facts. "But false views, if supported by some evidence, do little harm, for everyone takes a salutary pleasure in proving their falseness. And when this is done, one path towards error is closed, and the road to truth is open at the same time." So Darwin throws his ideas out into the wild, if you will, of conversation, thinking that if they're right, they'll survive, and or some variety of them will survive as they get transformed slightly. And truth emerges, not because it corresponds with the world, but it emerges from this struggle for existence. That just like species don't develop because they match some perfect form of species, they develop because of the struggle for existence. They don't correspond to some ideal. And that is the great difference that Darwin introduces into biology, into philosophy, into science. He certainly breaks from this great chain of being I've talked to you about. He doesn't think he's showing disrespect or dishonoring human beings. Not at all. He thinks that, as he says, he would rather be descending from the hairy ape than from some of the people he's seen. Darwin thinks instead that he has shown how change happens over long periods of time, and how to understand those changes by practicing genealogy in some of the ways we've described in these lectures. So in The Descent of Man, Darwin says, "We thus learn that man is descended from a hairy quadruped, furnished with a tail and pointed ears, probably arboreal in its habits, and an inhabitant of the old world. That's Darwin's brief and shocking statement in The Descent of Man, at the culmination of a career in which he solved the mystery of mysteries. But he solved it by saying, here's a way of thinking about change over time, and the way I think about change over time will change over time as other people use it. That truth emerges from the contest of ideas. Truth doesn't have to match something else, doesn't have to correspond to an essence. Truth comes through contestation. That's a message we'll see repeated often in this course through as we finish the semester, especially in the pragmatists later on in the semester. The truth is a compliment you give to the ideas you like, as Dick Rorty used to say. What really is important is that the contest of ideas, the perpetuation of inquiry, as Dewey would say, that out of the struggle of inquiry, things emerge that we call true as they start a new kind of struggle to see how to cope with the problems of the world. That model of thinking about truth and about evolution is a descendant of Darwin, just as Darwin is a descendant of this combination of the empiricists, the utilitarians, and the romantics, all culminating in the Darwinian revolution that changed the way we think about the place of humans in the universe. We'll see you next time when we go on to talk about a very different kind of subject as we discuss Charles Baudelaire and Friedrich Nietzsche. See you then.